A millionaire left his wife and their only daughter. The mother raised her alone, and 20 years later, the father returned on his daughter's wedding day. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Thank you for walking this journey with me. 30,000 hearts. I'm nothing without you, but I'll be honest. Lately my heart feels heavy. Something's wrong. Views are down. Watch time is falling. And I don't know if it's the writing or if you just miss my voice. But hold on to this. In the next 3 to 5 days I'll return. I'll speak to you again myself. Not because I have to, but because I miss you. Because I love you. Before I go, let me pray for you. Not just with words, but with my soul. I pray peace finds your restless mind and love finds your quiet pain. That strength rises where you felt weak, and that even in silence you remember this. You are never alone and never unloved. Please don't leave. I'm coming back and I need you here when I do. If you want me back, just like this video and comment, we want our Mr. Peter back. With all my love. Always.
The beautiful beginning and devastating end. In the golden autumn of 1983, love wore the face of a boy with poet's eyes and dreams that shimmered like captured starlight in morning dew. The first time Colleen Farrell saw Gary Matney, he was sitting beneath the ancient oak tree in the university courtyard, surrounded by scattered poetry books and wearing a sweater the color of October leaves. She had been hurrying to her literature class, arms full of notebooks and half-finished essays, when she heard him reading Neruda aloud to the autumn wind. His voice carried a melody that made hearts skip beats and birds pause their songs. I love you without knowing how or when or from where. The words drifted across the courtyard like silk on a gentle breeze, and Colleen found herself stopping, drawn to this stranger who spoke love as prayer. When their eyes met across that space filled with falling leaves, time seemed to fold. Gary's smile was soft and wondering, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. I was hoping someone would hear, he said, closing the book but keeping his finger marking the page. Poetry feels lonely when it's only shared with trees. Colleen laughed, the sound like silver bells in the crisp air. Trees are excellent listeners, though. They keep all your secrets and never judge your dramatic interpretations. From that moment, they were inseparable. Their love story unfolded like chapters in the most beautiful novel ever written. Gary would leave handwritten notes in her textbooks, little poems scribbled on napkins that made her classmates sigh with envy. He had a gift for finding magic in ordinary moments, turning study sessions into picnics on the library floor, making their cramped dorm rooms feel like palaces simply by being present. Their first kiss happened during a thunderstorm, standing under the covered walkway between the science and arts buildings. Rain poured down like nature's curtain, creating a private world just for them. I've been wanting to do this since that day under the oak tree, Gary whispered, his hands tender as butterflies as they framed her face. When their lips met, Colleen swore she could taste starlight and forever. Winter brought snow and deeper intimacy. They would walk for hours through the white-blanketed campus, sharing dreams that seemed to shimmer in the frosty air. Gary wanted to build something meaningful, not just businesses, but a life that mattered. He spoke of children with eyes like Colleen's, of Sunday mornings that lasted until noon, of growing old together somewhere peaceful. I want to love you until the stars forget how to shine, he told her one night as they lay on blankets in his dorm room, watching snowflakes dance outside the window. I want to love you through seasons and decades and lifetimes. Colleen traced patterns on his chest, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Promise me something, she whispered. Promise me we'll always talk to each other like this. Promise me we'll never let the world make us forget how to be tender with each other's hearts. I promise, Gary said, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like eternity. Spring arrived with engagement plans. Gary had been saving for months, working extra shifts at the campus bookstore and tutoring freshman economics students. He could have bought something flashy and new, but instead he chose his grandmother's sapphire ring, a delicate vintage piece with a stone the color of midnight seas. The proposal happened at their oak tree, now dressed in fresh green leaves that whispered love songs in the April breeze. Gary got down on one knee surrounded by daffodils that had pushed through the earth like tiny suns seeking light. "Colleen, you've made me believe in magic," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made me believe that dreams can come true if you're brave enough to chase them. Will you chase every dream with me? Will you marry me?" The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been waiting there all along. "Yes," she breathed, and then louder, laughing through happy tears. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding was small but perfect, held in the campus chapel where they'd often studied together during quiet afternoons. Colleen wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a simple white dress that made her look like an angel who'd chosen to stay on earth for love. Gary couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop touching her hand, couldn't stop whispering, "my wife," like it was the most beautiful phrase in any language. They honeymooned in a tiny cabin by a lake, spending their days reading to each other and their nights making love like they were discovering the concept for the first time. Gary would wake before dawn just to watch Colleen sleep, marveling at the miracle of being loved by someone so extraordinary. "You're staring," she murmured one morning, eyes still closed but lips curved in a sleepy smile. "I'm memorizing," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "I want to remember exactly how perfect this feels." The first year of marriage was painted in watercolor happiness. They lived in a cramped apartment with mismatched furniture and dreams that filled every corner. Gary worked his way up at a small investment firm while Colleen taught children at a local elementary school. Evenings were spent cooking together, dancing in their tiny kitchen to songs on the radio, planning for the future that stretched ahead of them like an endless garden of possibilities. When Colleen discovered she was pregnant in early 1986, Gary cried tears of pure joy. He spent hours talking to her growing belly, reading stories and singing lullabies in a voice made tender by love. "Hello, little miracle," he would whisper. "Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." The nursery became their shared obsession. Gary painted the walls a soft yellow since they wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. He assembled the crib with the careful precision of someone building a cathedral, while Colleen sewed tiny clothes and blankets, each stitch a prayer for their child's happiness. They would lie in bed at night, Gary's hand on Colleen's belly, feeling their baby move and dreaming about first steps, first words, first days of school. "She's going to be extraordinary," Gary would say, convinced they were having a daughter. "How do you know it's a she?" Colleen would tease. "Because any daughter of yours would have to be a queen," he'd reply, making her heart flutter with the same intensity as their first kiss. For their second wedding anniversary that spring, with Colleen 7 months pregnant, she planned the perfect surprise. She spent days preparing Gary's favorite meal, lasagna made from his mother's recipe, garlic bread that filled their apartment with the scent of home, and tiramisu that she'd practiced making until it was restaurant-worthy. She decorated their tiny dining room with candles and flowers from their window garden, creating a romantic sanctuary in their humble space. The table was set with their wedding china, only 4 place settings, but precious because they'd chosen each piece together. She wore the blue dress Gary loved, the one that made her eyes look like summer skies, and arranged her hair the way he'd admired since their college days. At 7 months pregnant, she glowed with the radiance of someone carrying their shared future. But when 6 o'clock became 7, then 8, then 9, the candles burned lower and the lasagna grew cold. Colleen sat at that beautiful table, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching the shadows lengthen and feeling the first cracks appear in her perfect world. By 10 o'clock, she began calling his office, his friends, anyone who might know where he was. No one had seen him since noon. At 11, she found herself standing in their bedroom, staring at the closet where half his clothes were missing. His college textbooks, gone. His grandmother's fountain pen, gone. The framed photo of them at graduation, gone. It was as if Gary Matney had decided to erase himself from their story, leaving behind only the echo of broken promises. Colleen sat at that beautiful table, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching the shadows lengthen and feeling the first cracks appear in her perfect world. By 10 o'clock, she began calling his office, his friends, anyone who might know where he was. No one had seen him. At midnight, she found the note on the kitchen counter, written in handwriting that had once penned love poems. The wedding ring, his grandmother's gift that had symbolized forever, sat beside it like a period at the end of a sentence that should have been the beginning of a beautiful story. I'm not ready for this. I'm not the man you think I am. You deserve better than what I can give you. Don't try to find me. Standing in that kitchen surrounded by the ruins of romance, 8 months pregnant and suddenly alone, Colleen placed both hands on her belly and made a vow that would shape everything that followed. You will know what real love looks like, little one, she whispered to the child growing inside her. You will never doubt your worth. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you that some people are meant to be lessons, not lifetimes. But that doesn't make the love any less real while it lasted. The sapphire ring caught the moonlight streaming through the window, and Colleen slipped it onto her right hand, where it would remain as a symbol not of what was lost, but of what was found. The strength to love completely, even when that love isn't returned, and the wisdom to know that being left doesn't mean being broken. Outside, the world slept peacefully, unaware that in a small apartment filled with the ghosts of dreams, a woman was discovering that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that bloom from the courage to keep believing in beauty after the world has tried to convince you that fairy tales don't come true. 3 weeks later, when Mooney Farrell was born on a snowy February morning in 1986, she entered the world surrounded by love that had been refined by fire, held by hands that had learned to be both tender and strong, welcomed by a mother who had transformed abandonment into the foundation for something extraordinary. Chapter 2. A Diamond Forged in Starlight, Mooney's Magical Childhood. 10 years had passed like seasons of healing, and in the warm glow of Seraphim's table, two souls had learned to dance together in perfect harmony, creating their own constellation of love in a world that had once seemed dark. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of Seraphim's table like liquid gold, painting rainbow patterns across the polished wood floors where 10-year-old Mooney Farrell sat, cross-legged, braiding wildflowers into crowns for the restaurant's centerpieces. Her dark hair caught the colored light, creating an ethereal halo around a face that seemed to hold depths beyond her years, behind eyes that sparkled with curiosity and compassion. It was 1996, and the restaurant had become their sanctuary, their kingdom, their proof that beautiful things could grow from broken ground. Colleen had named it Seraphim's Table, after the angels who purified with fire, a fitting tribute to how they had both been transformed by the flames of abandonment into something stronger and more luminous than before. "Mama," Muni said without looking up from her delicate work, "Mrs. Henderson from Table 6 has been crying into her coffee again. Her husband forgot their anniversary yesterday. Should I bring her one of the special chocolate hearts?" Colleen paused in her preparations for the lunch rush, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement that still, after all these years, could take her breath away. Muni had developed an uncanny ability to sense the emotional temperature of every room she entered, offering comfort with intuitive grace that seemed to come from some deeper well of understanding. "What do you think would help her most, sweetheart?" Colleen asked, knowing that Mooney's suggestions were often more insightful than those of trained counselors. Muni set down her flowers and tilted her head thoughtfully. "I think she needs to remember that love isn't about perfect moments or expensive gifts. Maybe if I tell her about how you make every ordinary Tuesday feel like Christmas morning just by singing while you cook, she'll remember that real love lives in small, daily choices." Colleen's heart swelled as she watched her daughter, this miraculous creature who had somehow emerged from heartbreak more beautiful than 1,000 perfect beginnings, rise and approach Mrs. Henderson's table. Within minutes, the older woman was smiling through her tears, listening to Mooney's thoughtful words about finding magic in everyday expressions of love. This was their life now, woven together like the most exquisite tapestry. Seraphim's table had become more than just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary where broken hearts came to heal and lonely souls found family. Colleen had poured her grief into creating something beautiful, transforming pain into purpose with every carefully crafted meal and lovingly decorated table. The transformation had begun 3 years earlier, when Celeste Evangeline walked into their lives like a fairy godmother dressed in Chanel. Celeste owned a chain of elegant restaurants throughout the state, and her reputation for discovering extraordinary talent was legendary. But when she tasted Colleen's signature dishes and witnessed the magic that happened when mother and daughter worked together, she saw something that transcended business success. "My dear," Celeste had said, sitting in their tiny apartment kitchen while 7-year-old Mooney served tea in mismatched cups with the solemnity of a priestess conducting a sacred ritual. "You don't just cook food. You create experiences that feed souls. And this little angel of yours—" She smiled at Muni, who was explaining why each teacup had its own personality and preferred different types of conversations. "She understands hospitality in ways that can't be taught, only felt." Celeste had become more than a mentor. She had become the mother figure Colleen had lost, the grandmother Mooney had never known. Under her guidance, Seraphim's table had blossomed into something extraordinary, a place where every detail spoke of love carefully applied, from the hand-painted murals that told stories of women throughout history to the fresh flowers that Mounier arranged each morning like prayers made visible. The restaurant's success had allowed them to move into the apartment above it, a cozy space filled with books and music and the constant aroma of whatever deliciousness was being prepared downstairs. Their evenings had evolved into something sacred. After the restaurant closed, they would sit together in the window seat, looking out at the stars and sharing the day's small miracles. "Tell me again about the brave queens, Mama," Mooney would request, as Colleen brushed her hair with strokes as gentle as butterfly wings. This had become their ritual, performed in front of the antique mirror that Celeste had gifted them, its silver surface reflecting generations of women's dreams. "Well," Colleen would begin, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytelling, "there was Cleopatra, who spoke 9 languages and ruled one of the greatest civilizations in history. She didn't need anyone to give her power because she understood that true strength comes from knowing your own worth." Muni's eyes would grow wide with wonder as her mother painted word pictures of extraordinary women. "And then there was Joan of Arc, barely older than you'll be someday, who heard courage whisper to her heart and saved an entire country because she believed in something greater than fear." "Like how you saved us when Daddy left?" Mooney asked one evening, her voice soft but certain. Colleen's hands stilled in her daughter's hair for just a moment. "Oh, my darling star, I didn't save us. We saved each other. You showed me that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to." Sometimes love looks like pancakes shaped like hearts on Tuesday mornings, or like building blanket forts during thunderstorms, or like learning that we can be complete all by ourselves. I think I understand, Mooney said, turning to face her mother with those eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies. Some people are shooting stars, beautiful for a moment but gone too quickly. We are constellations, eternal, connected, lighting the way for others who are lost in the dark. Colleen felt her breath catch. At 10 years old, her daughter had just articulated something it had taken her years to understand. And the best part about being a constellation, Mama, Mooney continued, her small hand finding Colleen's, is that we shine brightest, not when we're alone, but when we're together. It was in moments like these that Colleen understood she was raising something extraordinary. Mooney possessed an emotional intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, combined with a compassion that seemed to emanate from her very core. At school, she didn't just defend children who were being bullied. She created what she called the Kindness Club, where lonely kids could find belonging and hurting hearts could find healing. Everyone needs to feel valued, she explained to Colleen after organizing the club's first meeting in their school's garden. Not special like they're better than others, but valued like they matter, like their feelings count, like they have something beautiful to offer the world. The club had grown from 5 members to 30 in just 2 months, with children writing thank you notes to Mooney that read like letters to a guardian angel. Teachers whispered about the transformation they witnessed in their classrooms, how Mooney's presence seemed to elevate everyone around her, creating ripples of kindness that spread throughout the entire school. Her talents extended far beyond emotional intelligence. Mooney had taught herself to play piano by watching Colleen's hands during their evening music sessions, and her voice, when she sang along to the old standards they both loved, was pure magic. She devoured books like other children consumed candy, and her artwork, delicate watercolors of flowers and landscapes, adorned every wall of their apartment. But perhaps most remarkably, she had never once asked about her father with anything resembling resentment or longing. When other children at school spoke about their dads, Mounier would simply say, "My mama is my whole family, and she's enough for 100 people." Her contentment was so genuine, so complete, that even well-meaning adults stopped offering sympathy for her incomplete family. One particularly difficult evening, when a customer had been cruel about their simple decor and modest prices, Mooney found Colleen crying quietly in the restaurant's kitchen after closing. Without a word, the child climbed onto her mother's lap and began humming a lullaby that Colleen used to sing to her as a baby. "Mama," she said when the song ended, "do you know what makes this place more beautiful than any fancy restaurant in the world?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "Every person who eats here can feel how much love you put into their food. They can taste care in every bite. Rich people might have expensive plates, but they don't have what we have." "And what's that?" Muni smiled with the certainty of someone who had been raised on truth. "Hearts that know how to make ordinary moments feel like magic. We don't need to be completed by anyone, Mama. We're already whole." The sapphire ring on Colleen's finger caught the kitchen's warm light, and she realized that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being a symbol of what she'd lost and had become a reminder of what she'd found. The strength to build something beautiful from broken pieces, the courage to believe that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. As Mooney grew, so did her understanding of the world around her. She would recount stories from customers, anniversary celebrations, birthday surprises, reconciliations over shared desserts, while Colleen marveled at her daughter's ability to find profound meaning in simple human connections. "Everyone has a love story," Mooney observed one night, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. "Some are loud and dramatic, with grand gestures and big emotions. Others are quiet and steady, like the way Mr. Phillips comes in every Thursday and orders the same meal because it was his late wife's favorite, and eating it makes him feel close to her again. "Which kind do you think ours is?" Colleen asked, curious about her daughter's perspective on their unconventional but deeply loving life. Mooney was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think ours is the kind that proves love doesn't always come in the shape we expect, but it always comes in exactly the shape we need. We're not waiting to be rescued or completed. We're already living our happily ever after." Under the starlight streaming through their window, mother and daughter sat together, understanding that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories are the ones that bloom not from perfect beginnings, but from the courage to keep believing in beauty after the world has tried to convince you that fairy tales don't come true. "We are so much more than enough," Mooney whispered as she drifted toward sleep, and Colleen knew that every choice she had made, every tear she had shed, every moment of doubt she had overcome, had been worth it to hear those words spoken with such absolute certainty by this miraculous child who had taught her that love is not something you find, but something you become. Chapter 3. The Rose That Blooms in Winter. Mooney's enchanted teenage years. At 16, Mooney Farrell moved through the world like poetry in motion, leaving trails of wonder wherever she went, as if the universe had decided to demonstrate what happened when a soul was raised on pure love instead of conditions and expectations. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the concert hall stage, where Mooney stood with her violin, her dark hair cascading like silk as she drew the bow across the strings with movements that seemed choreographed by angels. The melody that filled the air wasn't just music, it was pure emotion given voice, and in the audience hardened critics found themselves wiping away unexpected tears. This was Mooney at 16 in 2002, a luminous young woman who had somehow managed to excel at everything she touched, while maintaining the humility that made people want to be better versions of themselves simply by being in her presence. She spoke 4 languages with the fluency of someone who understood that words were bridges between hearts, played violin like someone who had learned music from the stars themselves, and volunteered at the children's hospital where her presence seemed to have healing properties that doctors couldn't explain but were grateful to witness. "She doesn't just play music," observed Maestro Chen after her latest performance. "She channels something divine. In 40 years of teaching, I've never encountered anyone who could make an instrument weep with such beautiful sorrow or sing with such transcendent joy." The most remarkable thing about Mooney wasn't her extraordinary talents. It was her unwavering sense of self-worth, a quality so rare in teenagers that it drew attention from unexpected quarters. Like the afternoon when Harrison Delacroix, one of the wealthiest men in their city and father of Mooney's dearest friend Serafina, made an offer that revealed just how unshakable her foundation truly was. They were in the school's rose garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath climbing roses that seemed to bloom more vibrantly whenever she was near. Serafina had arranged the meeting, hoping her father might sponsor Mooney's college education, but Harrison had something more dramatic in mind. "Mooney, my dear," he said, his voice carrying the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I've been watching you for years through Serafina's stories, and I'm convinced you deserve opportunities that your current circumstances can't provide. I'd like to formally adopt you, give you the Delacroix name, and ensure you have access to the best schools, the finest instructors, unlimited resources. You could have everything: European tours, private tutors, a debut that would open every door in society." Serafina squeezed Mooney's hand encouragingly, clearly believing this was the answer to prayers she'd been silently sending on her friend's behalf. But Mooney was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a particular rose that was blooming despite the late autumn chill, its petals defying the season through sheer determination to exist beautifully. When she finally spoke, her words carried a quiet authority that made grown men pause and listen. Mr. Delacroix, I understand that your offer comes from kindness, and I'm grateful that you care enough about my future to make such a generous gesture. But I need to share something with you about true abundance. She stood gracefully, moving to touch the resilient rose. Riches aren't measured in bank accounts, but in the depth of love that surrounds you. I am the wealthiest girl alive because my mother gave me the universe in her embrace. She taught me that I don't need anyone to complete me or improve me or give me value I don't already possess. She turned to face him fully, and in that moment, Harrison Delacroix understood he was in the presence of something extraordinary. My mother and I have built something magical together, not just a restaurant, but a life that feeds souls and creates healing. I've learned languages not to impress society, but to comfort children at the hospital who are scared and far from home. I play violin not for concert halls, but for elderly patients who haven't heard music in months. These aren't accomplishments that need upgrading, sir. They're expressions of who I choose to be. Serafina watched her best friend with growing amazement, understanding for the first time that while she had been worrying about Mooney's circumstances, Mooney had been busy becoming the person everyone else wished they could be. I appreciate your desire to help, Mooney concluded, but the life you're offering is based on the assumption that what I have isn't enough. And that's where you're mistaken. I don't need to be rescued or elevated or transformed. I need to continue becoming exactly who I'm meant to be, and that journey begins and ends with the love that raised me. Harrison left that garden not offended but humbled, telling his wife later that evening, I went there to offer that girl a better life, and instead she taught me what wealth actually looks like. This incident became legendary at their school, spreading not through Mooney's boasting, but through Serafina's awed retelling. Soon everyone was talking about the girl who had turned down millions because she understood her own worth too deeply to be bought. It was during this period that love found Mooney in the most beautifully ordinary way. His name was Adrian Sinclair, a transfer student from France whose family had moved to the city for his father's diplomatic work. Adrian was studying literature and writing poetry in 3 languages, and he had the kind of soul that recognized kindness in others because he possessed it so deeply himself. Their first conversation happened in the school library during a February snowstorm, when Adrian found Mooney tutoring younger students in Spanish. He listened from a nearby table, mesmerized not just by her fluency but by her patience with a particularly struggling student. Languages are love letters to different parts of the world, he heard her say to the frustrated boy. When you speak Spanish, you're not just communicating words. You're connecting with the hearts of millions of people who see beauty in the same sounds. After her tutoring session ended, Adrian approached with nervous energy. Excuse me, he said in softly accented English. I couldn't help but overhear your explanation about languages being love letters. I write actual love letters. Well, love poems, and I've never heard anyone describe language learning so beautifully. Mooney looked up and found herself meeting eyes that seemed to hold entire libraries of poetry. You write love poems? How wonderful. Are they for someone special? Adrian blushed with endearing honesty. Not yet. I've been writing them for the idea of someone special, hoping that someday I'd meet a person worth sharing them with. Their relationship unfolded like a beautiful slow dance. Adrian would leave poems in Mooney's locker, thoughtful verses about the way she made ordinary moments feel significant. For 6 months they explored what it meant to be young and in love. Adrian brought out Mooney's playful side, while Mooney helped Adrian understand that kindness wasn't weakness, but strength. Their first kiss happened during a spring rain, standing under the school's covered walkway. It was sweet and innocent and everything a first kiss should be, tender, respectful, and full of promise. But as summer approached and Adrian prepared to move with his family to Geneva, They both recognized something that spoke to their maturity beyond their years. They loved each other, truly and purely, but they also understood that love at 16 was different from love that could last a lifetime. "I will always treasure these months," Adrian said on their last evening together, sitting in the same rose garden where Mooney had turned down millions. "You taught me what it means to love someone not because you need them, but because they make the world more beautiful just by existing in it." Mooney felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than devastation. "You taught me that I can love completely and still remain myself. That's a gift I'll carry forever." They parted with the grace of two people who understood that some love stories are meant to be chapters, not entire books, and that recognizing the difference was a sign of wisdom rather than failure. When Colleen asked about the quiet sadness that lingered for a few weeks after Adrian's departure, Mooney's response revealed the depth of understanding that continued to amaze her mother. "I'm not sad that it ended, Mama," she said, sitting in their window seat with her violin across her lap. "I'm grateful that it happened. Adrian showed me that I can choose to love someone completely while still choosing myself. That's going to make me brave enough to recognize the right kind of love when it finally arrives." The sapphire ring on Colleen's finger caught the evening light as she watched her daughter practice violin, and she smiled with the satisfaction of a mother who had succeeded in raising someone who would never settle for anything less than extraordinary love, because she had been shown every day of her life exactly what extraordinary love looked like. Chapter 4. When Two Souls Recognize Each Other. A love story written in the stars. The universe has a way of orchestrating perfect moments when hearts are ready to find their home. And on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in the university library in the autumn of 2007, destiny wore the face of a man whose soul had been searching for its missing piece without even knowing it was incomplete. Thunder rolled across the campus like ancient drums announcing something momentous as 21-year-old Mooney hurried through the library's Gothic corridors, her arms full of architectural history books and her hair damp from the storm that had caught her between buildings. She was pursuing her master's degree in art history while helping Colleen expand Seraphim's table into a small empire of healing spaces. And tonight she needed a specific volume on Byzantine influences in modern design. 5 years had passed since Adrian's gentle departure, 5 years during which Mooney had blossomed into a woman of extraordinary depth and grace. She had dated occasionally during college, thoughtful young men who appreciated her intelligence and kindness, but nothing had stirred her heart the way that first love had. She was content, fulfilled by her studies, her work at the Children's Hospital, and her role in making Seraphim's table a beacon of hope for anyone who needed to remember that love existed in the world. The book she sought was on the highest shelf in the poetry section, and as she stretched toward it, standing on her tiptoes like a dancer reaching for the stars, another hand appeared beside hers, longer fingers, artist's hands that moved with the same careful precision she recognized in her own creative work. When their fingers accidentally brushed, reaching for the same spine, the electricity was undeniable. 20 love poems and a song of despair, said a voice like warm honey over gravel, tinged with an accent that spoke of distant shores and midnight conversations. Neruda understood that architecture and poetry are cousins. Both try to create spaces where souls can exist beautifully. Mooney turned and found herself looking into eyes the color of midnight seas during storms, set in a face that seemed carved from dreams and starlight. Time didn't just pause, it held its breath. The stranger was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it while lost in thought, and he held the book between them like an offering. "I was actually reaching for the architecture text beside it," Mooney said, though her voice had gone soft with something that felt like recognition. "But you're right about Neruda. He builds cathedrals with words. Lysander Beaumont, he said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed to illuminate the dim corner of the library. Architecture student, amateur poet, and apparently someone who reaches for books at exactly the right moment to meet someone extraordinary. Muni Farrell, she replied, and when their hands touched, she swore she could feel electricity singing between their palms. Art history student, restaurant owner, and someone who apparently needed to get caught in a thunderstorm to find exactly what she didn't know she was looking for. Unlike her sweet first love with Adrian, which had felt like learning to swim in calm waters, this felt like being caught in a riptide of recognition, not overwhelming, but undeniably powerful. At 21, with the wisdom of her first heartbreak behind her, and the confidence that came from knowing her own worth, Mooney understood the difference between love that teaches and love that transforms. "Would you like to sit and wait out the storm?" Lysander asked, gesturing toward a reading alcove surrounded by centuries of love stories and poetry. "I have a feeling this rain isn't stopping anytime soon, and I'd love to hear why an art history student needs Byzantine architectural texts." What followed was the kind of conversation that exists outside of time, hours that felt like minutes and minutes that contained eternities. Mooney told him about her vision for creating restaurants that weren't just places to eat, but sanctuaries where people could experience beauty and healing simultaneously. Lysander shared his dream of designing buildings that honored both human needs and artistic vision, structures that would make people feel elevated simply by existing within them. "Most architects think about form and function," he said, his eyes growing bright with passion. "But I think about emotion and memory. I want to design homes where children will feel safe enough to dream big dreams, restaurants where strangers become friends over shared meals, public spaces where communities remember how to care for each other." Mooney felt her heart perform a complicated dance in her chest. "That's exactly what my mother did with Seraphim's table, except she used food and hospitality instead of blueprints and beams. She created a space where people's souls could rest." "Your mother sounds like an artist," Lysander said. "Building healing spaces takes the same vision as designing beautiful buildings. You have to understand that environments shape hearts." They talked until the storm passed and the library began turning off lights around them, neither wanting to break the spell that had settled over their corner of the world. Lysander walked her back to her apartment through streets washed clean by rain, and at her door he did something that made Mooney's heart sing with recognition. Instead of trying to kiss her goodnight, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and tore out a page covered with architectural sketches. Quickly, he drew a tiny building with exquisite detail, arched windows, climbing ivy, a door that seemed to invite visitors into warmth and welcome. "This is how I'll remember tonight," he said, handing her the drawing. "The moment I realized that some buildings are made of stone and steel, but the most beautiful ones are made of conversation and connection." Mooney looked at the sketch, understanding that she was holding something precious. "It looks like a place where love stories begin," she said softly. "Or where they recognize each other," Lysander replied, and the way he looked at her made her feel like she was the most beautiful architectural marvel he'd ever encountered. Their courtship unfolded like the most exquisite slow dance, each moment building upon the last to create something that felt both destined and carefully chosen. Lysander would surprise her with picnics in hidden courtyards around the city, places where he'd arrange breadcrumbs into miniature building designs while she painted watercolor sketches of flowers. He understood that Muni appreciated artistry in all its forms, so he courted her with beauty, carefully applied to ordinary moments. "Look," he said one afternoon as they sat by the campus fountain, pointing to a small structure he'd built from sandwich crusts and apple slices. "A chapel for ants who want to get married." Muni laughed with delight. the sound making nearby students look over with smiles, because joy, they'd discovered, was contagious when it was this pure. "You're completely magical," she told him. "You find ways to make every moment feel like a celebration." "That's what you do to the world just by existing in it," Lysander replied, his voice serious despite their playful surroundings. "You make everything more beautiful simply by being present." Unlike her relationship with Adrian, which had been sweet but ultimately transient, this felt like coming home to a part of herself she hadn't known was missing. Lysander didn't just appreciate her independence, he celebrated it. He didn't want to complete her. He wanted to build a life alongside her where both of their dreams could flourish. Their dates became legendary among their friends, dancing in empty lecture halls to music only they could hear, building elaborate sandcastles at the beach that looked like fairy tale palaces, spending entire afternoons in bookstores reading poetry aloud to each other. Lysander seemed to understand instinctively that Mooney had been raised on beauty and would recognize authentic romance when she encountered it. One evening, as they walked through the botanical gardens where night-blooming flowers released their fragrance into the darkness, Lysander stopped beneath a pergola covered in jasmine and turned to face her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Mooney," he said, his voice soft with wonder, "I need you to know something. I've spent my entire life designing spaces where people could feel at home, but I never understood what home actually meant until I met you. Home isn't a building. It's the feeling of being completely known and completely accepted for exactly who you are." Mooney felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of being truly seen. "Lysander, you make me feel like the best version of myself, not because you're trying to change me, but because you celebrate who I already am. I want to spend my life celebrating you," he said, taking her hands in his with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "I want to wake up every morning grateful for the privilege of loving you, and I want to fall asleep every night amazed that someone as extraordinary as you chose to love me back." When he kissed her beneath that canopy of stars and jasmine, Mooney understood what poets meant when they wrote about souls recognizing their other half. This wasn't the desperate passion of people trying to fill empty spaces in themselves. This was the joyful recognition of two complete people choosing to create something beautiful together. Months passed like pages in the most romantic novel ever written. Lysander learned to cook Colleen's favorite recipes so he could help at Seraphim's table during busy evenings, not because he was trying to impress, but because he understood that loving Muni meant loving the life she'd built with her mother. Colleen, in turn, saw in Lysander the kind of man she'd always hoped would find her daughter, someone who enhanced Muni's light instead of trying to possess it. "He looks at her like she hung the moon," Celeste observed one evening as they watched the young couple work together, organizing flowers for the restaurant's tables. "But more importantly, he helps her remember that she's capable of creating her own light." The proposal happened in the garden where Colleen had once made her vow to baby Muni, surrounded by roses that seemed to bloom more vibrantly in response to the love radiating from this sacred space. Lysander had asked permission from both women, understanding that he wasn't gaining a wife so much as being invited to join a constellation of love that had been shining beautifully long before he arrived. He knelt among the flowers as evening painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, holding a vintage emerald ring that complemented rather than competed with the sapphire that had never left Colleen's hand. "Muni," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I don't want to complete you because you're already perfect. I want to adventure through life as your chosen partner, building beautiful things together while celebrating the individual magic we each bring to our shared story." The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been waiting there since the beginning of time, and when Mooney said yes, her voice rang with the certainty of someone who had been raised to recognize true love when it finally arrived. I choose you, she said, framing his face with hands that seemed to bless whatever they touched. Not because I need you to make me whole, but because loving you makes me the most authentic version of myself. I choose the adventure of becoming ourselves together. At 21, having learned the difference between love that teaches and love that transforms, Mounier was ready to begin the greatest adventure of her life with someone who truly deserved to walk beside her. Chapter 5. When shadows try to eclipse the sun, the serpent returns to Eden. 22 years can transform a coward into a successful businessman, but they cannot alchemize a hollow heart into something capable of genuine love. And when Gary Matney walked through the doors of Seraphim's Table on a crisp October evening in 2008, he carried with him the entitled expectation that money could purchase what patience and presence had failed to build. The evening rush at Seraphim's Table was in full symphony when Gary entered, his expensive Italian shoes echoing against hardwood floors that had been polished by years of love and laughter. He stood in the doorway like a discord in a perfectly tuned orchestra, his silver hair and tailored suit speaking of wealth, acquired but not wisdom-earned, success measured in numbers that meant nothing to hearts that had learned to calculate abundance differently. Colleen was at her usual table in the corner, wedding planning materials spread before her like flower petals, each detail of Mooney's upcoming celebration chosen with the care of someone who understood that true luxury lay in thoughtfulness, not expense. At 42, she had transformed from the broken girl Gary had abandoned into a woman of quiet power, her restaurant empire testament to what could be built when pain was alchemized into purpose. The sapphire ring on her finger caught the candlelight as she reviewed seating charts that read like a roster of love stories. Customers whose hearts had healed over her meals, staff members who had become family, friends who had proven that chosen bonds were often stronger than blood. This was to be more than just a wedding. It was a celebration of every form of love that had flourished in Gary's absence. She looked up from a handwritten seating chart, her pen pausing mid-sentence, and for a moment time folded in on itself. The boy who had once read her poetry beneath autumn oak trees was still visible in the features of this expensively dressed stranger. But where tenderness had once lived, there was now only the restless energy of someone who had spent decades trying to fill an emptiness that no amount of money could satisfy. "Hello, Colleen," Gary said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of boardroom presentations but trembling slightly at the edges where memory lived. "You look incredible. You look exactly like I always knew you would." Every conversation in the restaurant didn't stop, but it softened, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see how love and abandonment would speak to each other after 22 years of silence. Aurelius Sterling, who had been discussing wine selections with another table, moved closer with the protective instincts of a brother who had helped rebuild what this man had shattered. "You don't belong here," Colleen said, her voice calm as still water, each word carrying the authority of someone who had learned to protect her peace at all costs. "This is a place for people who understand the value of what they have while they have it." Gary's confidence flickered like a candle in wind, but he pressed forward with the determination of someone who had convinced himself that money could retroactively justify any choice. "I've spent fortunes trying to find you, Colleen. Private investigators, search firms, connections in every major city. I never stopped thinking about you, about our daughter. I never stopped hoping I could make things right." "Our daughter." The words escaped Colleen's lips with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so completely devoid of humor. "You've never met our daughter, Gary. You forfeited that privilege the moment you chose to walk away from the most precious gift the universe could offer." Gary's eyes swept the restaurant, taking in details he had been too self-absorbed to notice upon entering. The hand-painted murals depicting strong women throughout history, the fresh flowers arranged with artistic precision, the way staff moved with genuine care for every guest. This wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary built from the ashes of his abandonment. "I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice taking on the pleading quality of someone who had never learned the difference between remorse and entitlement. "I was young, I was scared, I wasn't ready for the responsibility. But I'm successful now, Colleen. I can give you everything I couldn't before. I can give our daughter everything she deserves." Lysander chose that moment to enter from the kitchen, his architect's hands still dusted with flour from helping prepare tomorrow's bread, his presence immediately changing the energy of the room from tension to protection. He moved to Colleen's side with the natural grace of someone who belonged exactly where he was, someone who had earned his place through daily choices to show up and care. "Mrs. Farrell," he said, using the formal address they maintained in public, even though he'd become the son Colleen had never expected to gain. "Is everything all right here?" Gary looked at this young man who stood beside Colleen with such obvious devotion, and for the first time began to understand the magnitude of what he had lost. This wasn't just a family he had abandoned. This was a constellation of love that had continued to shine and grow and create beauty in his absence, proving that some things become more magnificent when freed from the weight of those who never deserved to witness their brilliance. "I'm Gary Matney," he said, extending his hand toward Lysander with the assumption that names from the past still carried currency in the present. "Muni's father." Lysander looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then chose instead to place his own protectively on the back of Colleen's chair. "I'm Lysander Beaumont," he replied with quiet dignity. "Mooney's chosen family, and I think you should know that titles like father aren't claimed through biology alone. They're earned through love expressed in 1,000 daily choices to be present when presence matters." The truth of those words landed like arrows finding their mark, and Gary felt something crumble inside him. Not his resolve, but his carefully constructed narrative that he had been a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own devastating choices. Colleen stood then, her movement fluid and certain, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of every midnight feeding. Every scraped knee comforted, every dream nurtured and celebrated by a mother who had learned to be both sun and shelter for her precious child. "You think Mooney was lacking something because you weren't here," she said, each word precise as a surgeon's cut. "You think our life was diminished by your absence. You couldn't be more wrong. Your leaving was the greatest gift you ever gave us, because it meant she was raised by people who understood that love is a choice made new every morning, not a feeling that comes and goes like weather." She gestured around the restaurant, where customers had returned to their conversations, but continued to steal glances at this unfolding drama, sensing they were witnessing something that would become legend. "This place exists because I learned to transform pain into purpose. My daughter grew up watching me choose joy over bitterness, growth over stagnation, building over breaking. She learned that strength isn't the absence of struggle, it's the choice to create beauty anyway." Celeste Evangeline appeared at Colleen's shoulder like a guardian angel in pearls and wisdom, her elegant presence adding another layer of protection around the family that had been forged in fire and tempered by unconditional love. "Sir," she said to Gary with the kind of polite authority that makes powerful men remember their manners, "I think you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. You seem to believe that these ladies needed rescuing, when in fact they've spent the last 22 years doing the rescuing of broken hearts, lost souls, and anyone lucky enough to find their way into this sanctuary they built with their own hands." Gary looked around the restaurant with new eyes, finally seeing what he had been too blinded by his own assumptions to recognize. Every detail spoke of love carefully applied, not just in the decor, but in the way a waitress gently encouraged a shy child to try something new, How the bartender listened patiently to an elderly regular's stories, the way light seemed to gather around tables where important conversations were happening. "I want to meet her," he said, his voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "I want to meet my daughter." "Your daughter," Colleen repeated, and the sapphire ring caught the light as she clasped her hands together, "is getting married in 2 weeks to a man who has spent 3 years proving daily that he deserves the privilege of loving her. She is surrounded by friends who would step in front of traffic to protect her happiness, mentors who have guided her to become extraordinary, and a community that celebrates her existence as the gift it is." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the intimate tone of someone sharing a secret. "She knows about you, Gary. She's always known, and she made peace long ago with the fact that some people are lessons rather than blessings, teachers rather than treasures. You taught her by your absence to recognize the difference between people who love conditionally and people who love without limits." "But she's my blood," Gary protested, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Blood," said Aurelius Sterling, speaking for the first time since taking his protective position near their table, "is just biology. Family is choice, and this family chose each other every single day for 22 years. You can't buy your way into that kind of love, and you can't claim it just because you finally decided you want it." The restaurant had grown quiet again, not from nosiness but from the recognition that they were witnessing something sacred. Not a reunion, but a revelation of what love looks like when it's built on foundation of presence rather than promises, daily devotion rather than grand gestures. Gary stood in that space surrounded by the love he had walked away from, finally understanding that success without relationship is just expensive loneliness, and that some losses can never be recovered, only learned from. The family he had imagined waiting for his return had instead flourished in his absence, becoming something more beautiful than his limited vision could have ever encompassed. "I want to make this right," he said one final time, but even as the words left his lips, he knew they carried no weight in a room where right had been defined, not by dramatic returns but by daily choices to love well. "Then live a life worthy of the love you threw away," Colleen said with final authority. "But live it somewhere else. We have a wedding to plan, and it's going to be beautiful." As Gary walked toward the door, his expensive shoes now seeming to echo like empty promises against floors that had been blessed by authentic joy, he passed tables where couples held hands and families laughed together, where the love he had always taken for granted was being celebrated and nurtured by people who understood its value. For the first time in 22 years, Gary Matney understood that he hadn't just lost a family. He had lost the privilege of witnessing daily miracles, the joy of being needed by hearts that knew how to love completely, and the honor of being part of something more beautiful than any empire he could ever build with money alone. Chapter 6. The Princess Who Needed No Rescue, When Grace Becomes a Weapon. There are moments in life when the universe holds its breath to witness pure grace in action, and when 22-year-old Mooney Farrell stood in the golden afternoon light of her favorite bookstore cafe, surrounded by love and faced with a stranger's attempt to buy his way into her heart, she became poetry in motion, a masterclass in dignity that would be remembered long after the last word was spoken. The Pages and Prose Cafe had always been Muni's sanctuary, a corner of the world where literary souls gathered to discuss philosophy over perfectly brewed coffee, and where she had spent countless afternoons with her chosen family, planning dreams and sharing secrets beneath vintage chandeliers that cast everything in the warm glow of old romance. Today she sat at her usual round table by the window, surrounded by the people who made up her constellation of love. Serafina Delacroix, perched on the velvet cushions like an elegant bird of paradise, her loyalty as fierce as her fashion sense was impeccable, while Isabeau Valentina spread legal briefs across the antique wood with the focused intensity of someone who fought injustice for a living. Lysander sat beside his fiancée with the comfortable closeness of souls who had found their home in each other, occasionally reaching over to tuck a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, with the reverence of someone who still couldn't quite believe he had won the universe's greatest lottery. They were reviewing final details for the wedding, seating arrangements that read like a guest list for a celebration of love itself, menu choices that honored both tradition and innovation, and small touches that would make their ceremony feel like a benediction rather than just a party. The engagement ring on Mooney's finger caught the afternoon light as she gestured, the emerald seeming to dance with its own inner fire. "I still can't believe Caspian managed to get those musicians," Serafina said, referring to the string quartet that usually only performed for royalty and heads of state. "How does he work such magic?" "The same way all of us do," Mooney replied with a smile that could power entire cities. "He believes that love deserves the most beautiful celebration possible, and he puts that belief into action every single day." It was in this moment of perfect contentment that the messenger arrived, a young man in an expensive suit who clearly felt uncomfortable delivering his wealthy employer's presumptuous gift. He approached their table with the nervous energy of someone who sensed he was about to interrupt something sacred. "Miss Farrell," he asked hesitantly, "I have a delivery for you from Mr. Gary Matney." The name fell into their peaceful gathering like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of tension that seemed to darken the very air around them. Lysander's hand found Mooney's instantly, not to protect her but to remind her that she was not alone, that whatever this moment brought, she would face it surrounded by love that had been earned through presence and proven through time. "I didn't request anything from anyone by that name," Mooney said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had been raised to trust her own instincts above all external pressures. The messenger shifted uncomfortably, clearly rehearsing words he'd been paid to deliver. "He asked me to tell you that he's your father, and he wants to give you the wedding you deserve." A silence settled over the cafe that seemed to spread beyond their table, as if everyone in the vicinity could sense that something significant was unfolding. The other patrons didn't stare, but conversations grew quieter, as if they understood they were witnessing a moment that demanded respect. The messenger placed a cream-colored envelope on their table, thick with expensive paper, and sealed with the kind of wax that whispered of old money and older assumptions. Beside it, he set a long white box tied with silver ribbon that practically screamed of jewelry stores where price tags started in the 5 figures. "He said to tell you," the young man continued, his discomfort growing more obvious with each word, "that he knows he can't make up for lost time, but he can ensure that your wedding is everything a princess deserves. He's prepared to pay for whatever you want. Any venue, any designer, any guest list. He said money is no object when it comes to his daughter's happiness." Mooney looked at the envelope and box for a long moment, her expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know her well. But Lysander, who had learned to read the subtle language of her emotions like poetry written in a familiar hand, saw the exact moment when disappointment transformed into something far more powerful. Not anger, which would have given Gary's gesture more importance than it deserved, but a crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. She picked up the envelope first, opening it with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life. Inside was a check that made Isabeau whistle low under her breath, $1 million made out to Princess Muni, with a memo line that read, "For the wedding of your dreams." Accompanying the check was a letter written on letterhead that probably cost more per sheet than most people spent on groceries in a week. Gary's words flowed across the expensive paper like a river of regret and entitlement, speaking of private investigators and business success, of wanting to make everything right and give you the life you should have had. "My dearest daughter," It began as if the title hadn't been forfeited 22 years ago. I know I have no right to walk back into your life, but I also know that I can't let you get married without trying to give you something worthy of the extraordinary woman I've been told you've become. I'm a wealthy man now, successful beyond what your mother and I ever dreamed possible when we were young and foolish. This check is just the beginning. I want to pay for everything. I want to make sure your wedding is fit for the princess you've always been in my heart." When Mooney finished reading, she folded the letter with movements that seemed choreographed by grace itself, then reached for the white box. Inside, nestled in midnight blue velvet, lay a diamond necklace that caught the cafe's warm light and threw it back in 1,000 brilliant fragments, the kind of piece that belonged in museum displays or on red carpets, beautiful and cold and completely without personal meaning. "Well," said Seraphina, her voice tight with the kind of protective anger that comes from watching someone you love be insulted in the most expensive way possible, "that's certainly presumptuous." Isabeau leaned forward, her lawyer's mind already cataloging the assumptions and legal implications. $1 million and a necklace that probably cost another 100,000. Someone has clearly confused throwing money around with actual parenting. But it was Lysander's reaction that spoke volumes about the man Muni had chosen to love. He looked at the check and necklace with something that might have been pity, not for what Gary was offering, but for how little he understood about the woman he was trying to impress. "He has no idea who you are," Lysander said softly, his voice filled with wonder rather than anger. "He thinks you're someone who can be impressed by price tags instead of someone who measures value in entirely different currencies." Mooney stood then, the movement fluid and purposeful, and every eye in the cafe found itself drawn to her without conscious decision. She wore a simple sundress the color of summer sky, her dark hair falling in waves around shoulders that seemed to carry the authority of queens. And when she smiled, it was with the kind of serene confidence that made observers understand they were about to witness something extraordinary. She picked up the check first, holding it between elegant fingers that had braided flower crowns and comforted crying children and learned to create beauty from the simplest materials. Then, with movements that seemed choreographed by destiny itself, she began to tear the paper into perfect pieces, not with violent emotion, but with the precise artistry of someone who understood that symbolic gestures should be as beautiful as they are meaningful. Each piece of the check fluttered to the antique table like expensive confetti, and the silence in the cafe became complete as patrons realized they were witnessing something that would become legend, not just in their small community, but in their own understanding of what dignity looked like when it was wielded by someone who had never doubted her own worth. "A father," Mooney said, her voice carrying like a bell across the reverent silence, "is not a title you claim through biology or money. A father is earned through 3 a.m. fevers and first day of school nerves, through believing in impossible dreams and catching tears before they fall." She lifted the diamond necklace, letting it catch the light like captured ice. "This is beautiful, but beauty without love is just expensive emptiness. I was raised on a different kind of wealth, the kind that grows when shared, strengthens under pressure, and teaches you that your worth was never, ever up for negotiation." The necklace joined the pieces of check on the table, its diamonds seeming suddenly less brilliant in the presence of the light that emanated from Muni herself. "You want to know what a princess looks like?" she asked, though the question was rhetorical because everyone in that space could see exactly what royalty looked like when it was earned through character rather than inherited through circumstance. A princess is someone who was taught to recognize her own value so completely that she can't be bought, manipulated, or convinced to settle for anything less than extraordinary love. A princess is someone who builds her own castle through daily choices to create beauty and healing in the world. A princess is someone who understands that the most precious gifts can't be purchased in any store. They're given through presence, patience, and the kind of love that shows up every single day. She looked around the cafe at faces that had grown soft with emotion, understanding that her words were landing in hearts that had perhaps forgotten what authentic power looked like. "I have everything I need," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have a mother who taught me to fly by showing me my own wings. I have friends who chose to love me not because of what I could give them, but because of who I am when I'm most myself. I have a fiancé who sees my light and wants to help it shine brighter, not possess it for himself." The emerald on her finger seemed to pulse with its own inner fire as she gestured toward Lysander, whose love for her was written so clearly across his features that even strangers could read it. "I have mentors who became family, a community that celebrates my existence, and a life so rich with meaning that I wake up every morning grateful for the privilege of living it." She picked up the letter then, holding it gently as if it were something fragile rather than insulting. "Thank you," she said, addressing words to someone who wasn't present, but whose presence had been felt like a storm cloud in their sunshine. "Thank you for the lesson your absence taught me, that some people mistake taking for loving, leaving for strength, money for affection. Thank you for teaching me to recognize the difference between people who love conditionally and people who love without limits." The cafe held its collective breath as Mooney placed the letter back on the table beside the torn check and abandoned necklace. "I forgive you," she said with the authority of someone who understood that forgiveness was a gift she gave herself, not a pardon she granted others. "I forgive you for not being ready to love something as precious as what you walked away from. I forgive you for thinking that absence could be retroactively justified by affluence. But forgiveness is not reconciliation, and understanding is not invitation." She looked directly at the messenger, whose expression had transformed from discomfort to something approaching awe. "Please tell the person who sent you that I wish him peace and healing, but that peace and healing happen in individual hearts, not in other people's acceptance of belated apologies. Tell him that his daughter grew up beautifully without him, and she's about to marry a man who proves every day that love is a choice made new each morning." The silence that followed was reverent, broken only by the soft sound of tears being discreetly wiped away by patrons who had never expected their afternoon coffee to come with a master class in dignity. Muni sat back down with the same fluid grace with which she had risen, reaching immediately for Lysander's hand, as if this entire encounter had been nothing more than a brief interruption in their wedding planning. "Now," she said with a smile that could have powered the entire city, "where were we with the music selection? I think Caspian's quartet idea is perfect, but I want to make sure we include at least one song that will make everyone remember what love is supposed to feel like." The messenger gathered the rejected gifts with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he had just witnessed something that would change his own understanding of what true wealth looked like. As he left the cafe, the torn check and abandoned necklace seemed to weigh more than gold in his hands, carrying with them the lesson that some hearts are too rich to be purchased and some souls too wise to be fooled by the glitter of fool's gold. Chapter 7. Building Castles in the Clouds, When Love Creates Its Own Magic. In the days leading up to a wedding that promised to redefine what celebration looked like when love was the architect, every detail became a prayer made visible, every choice a testament to the truth that the most beautiful ceremonies are not purchased, but created by hearts that understand the sacred nature of witnessed promises. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Aurelia Rosemont's atelier like liquid gold, illuminating bolts of silk and lace that seemed to whisper secrets about all the love stories they had adorned throughout the years. Muni stood on the small pedestal in the center of the room, wearing what could only be described as a dream made manifest, a gown that Aurelia had designed not just for a wedding, but for a moment when earth would briefly touch heaven. The dress was a symphony in ivory and moonlight, crafted from vintage French lace that had once belonged to Celeste Evangeline's grandmother, now carefully restored and embroidered with symbols of strength from cultures around the world. Phoenix birds soared across the bodice in threads of silver and gold, while delicate cherry blossoms from Japanese tradition danced along the flowing skirt. Celtic knots representing eternal love, intertwined with African Adinkra symbols for endurance, creating a tapestry that told the story of every woman who had ever loved deeply enough to transform the world. "Oh, my darling star," Colleen whispered, her hands pressed to her heart. "You look like you've captured starlight and decided to wear it to your wedding." Serafina sat curled in the velvet armchair, tears streaming down her face as she watched her best friend transformed into something that belonged in fairy tales. "I'm going to cry through the entire ceremony," she declared, though her voice carried pure joy. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Celeste Evangeline, elegant in her pearls and wisdom, moved around Mooney with the reverence of someone who understood she was witnessing something sacred. At 73, she had attended hundreds of weddings, but she had never seen a bride who seemed to glow from within the way Mooney did. "This lace tells stories," Celeste said, running gentle fingers over the intricate patterns. "My grandmother wore it to her wedding in 1923. My mother wore it to hers in 1951, and I wore it when I married my dear Charles in 1975. Now it begins a new chapter with a young woman who understands that some legacies are not inherited but earned." Little Sophia Delacroix, Serafina's 8-year-old sister who would serve as flower girl, bounced excitedly on the velvet ottoman. "You look like the princess in my favorite story, the one who saves the kingdom, not because she has to, but because she knows how to love everyone back to life." Aurelia stepped back to survey her creation with the critical eye of an artist who knew she had just completed her masterpiece. She was a woman who had dressed royalty and celebrities, but she had never felt the profound satisfaction that came from knowing she had helped love itself find its perfect expression. "The final touch," Aurelia said, lifting a crown-like tiara from its velvet box. It wasn't traditional wedding jewelry, but something far more meaningful. A delicate circlet woven from silver threads shaped to look like climbing vines, with tiny emeralds scattered like dewdrops among the leaves. "Lysander designed this himself. He said he wanted you to wear something that showed the world you are already royalty in your own right." When the tiara settled into Mooney's dark hair, completing a picture that seemed painted by angels, the room fell into reverent silence. This wasn't just a bride preparing for her wedding day. This was a young woman stepping into her destiny, surrounded by the women who had helped her understand what it meant to be beloved. "Now," said Isabeau Valentina, emerging from behind a curtain where she had been struggling with her own fitting, "someone needs to explain to me how I'm supposed to walk down an aisle in this gorgeous creation without tripping." Her maid of honor dress was a complimentary masterpiece in sage green silk, designed to be beautiful without competing with the bride's radiance. The fitting became an impromptu celebration as the women who made up Mooney's chosen family gathered around her, each adding their own blessing to the ceremony days away. They shared stories of love and triumph, speaking of marriages they had witnessed that proved love was not just a feeling, but a daily choice to see the best in another person. "I remember when my grandmother told me about true love," Celeste said, settling into her chair. "She said it wasn't about finding someone who made you feel complete, but about finding someone who inspired you to become the most authentic version of yourself." "Like how Lysander makes you more yourself, not less," Serafina observed, watching as Mooney's face took on the soft glow it always carried when her fiancé was mentioned. He doesn't try to change anything about you. He just creates space for you to be even more wonderfully you. Meanwhile, across the city, Caspian Blackthorn was orchestrating romantic perfection in the historic chapel where Moony and Lysander would exchange vows. He moved through the sacred space like a conductor preparing for the most important symphony of his career, each detail carefully chosen to honor the love story that had brought two souls together. The chapel was being transformed into something that looked like it had been decorated by nature herself, climbing roses and jasmine, creating natural archways, hundreds of candles casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed centuries of promises. The musicians will be positioned here, he explained to Aurelia Sterling, who had insisted on overseeing every security detail. The string quartet will play as guests arrive, then transition to the processional when our beautiful bride appears. In the chapel's preparation room, Raphael Montgomery was reviewing final details with Pastor Williams, who had known Colleen since the early days of Seraphim's Table and had watched Moony grow from a thoughtful child into an extraordinary woman. "This wedding represents something rare in my experience," Raphael said. "Two people who genuinely bring out the best in each other, surrounded by a community that understands what sacred commitment looks like." Back at the atelier, each woman present had contributed something meaningful to Moony's bridal ensemble: Celeste's family lace, Seraphina's grandmother's pearl earrings, Isabeau's gift of a delicate bracelet that had belonged to her mother, and Colleen's sapphire ring, which would be moved to Moony's right hand during the ceremony so that her wedding band could take its place beside the emerald engagement ring. "I have one more gift," Colleen said, producing a small velvet box that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Inside was a pendant, unlike anything they had ever seen, a delicate chain holding a small glass vial that contained what looked like stardust and moonlight. "This was made from sand from the beach where I used to take you when you were small, the place where we would build sand castles and dream about your future. I wanted you to carry a piece of all our beautiful beginnings with you as you start this new chapter." When Moony lifted the pendant from its box, the contents seemed to shimmer and dance as if they were alive with memory and magic. "Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's like carrying our entire love story close to my heart." The women gathered around as Colleen fastened the chain around her daughter's neck, the pendant settling just above her heart, where it seemed to pulse with its own gentle light. In that moment, surrounded by generations of love and witnessing, they all understood that some ceremonies begin long before anyone walks down an aisle. They begin in the daily choices to love well, to choose joy over bitterness, and to believe that the most beautiful celebrations are those that honor what has already been built. 3 days, Seraphina said softly, her voice filled with anticipation and joy. "In 3 days, you're going to marry your best friend in front of everyone who loves you most, wearing a dress that tells the story of strong women throughout history, carrying the blessings of every heart that helped shape you into who you are." Mounier laughed, the sound filling the atelier like the most beautiful music, and in that moment everyone present understood that they weren't just witnessing wedding preparations. They were witnessing the culmination of a love story that had been written by the universe itself, starring two souls who had learned that the most beautiful celebrations happen when love is both the guest of honor and the reason for gathering. Chapter 8. The Day Angels Dance. Wedding Day, when love writes its own vows. When morning broke on November 15th, 2008, what would forever be remembered as the day love taught everyone present what sacred celebration looked like, the universe seemed to pause in reverent anticipation, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that photographers would later swear had been touched by divine hands, as if creation itself wanted to provide the perfect backdrop for promises that would echo through eternity. The historic chapel of St. Magdalene stood like a jewel against the morning sky, its ancient stones warmed by centuries of prayers and blessed by the kind of love that transforms ordinary moments into something eternal. Inside, Caspian Blackthorn's vision had come to life with breathtaking beauty. Climbing roses and jasmine created natural archways that seemed to have grown from the very walls, while hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows that made the sacred space feel like it existed somewhere between earth and heaven. In the bridal suite, Mooney sat before an antique mirror that had been borrowed from Celeste's personal collection, watching as her chosen family prepared to witness the most important day of her life. The morning light streaming through stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across her gown, making Aurelia's masterpiece seem to shimmer with its own inner magic. "You're glowing," Serafina observed, applying final touches to her own makeup, while keeping one eye on her best friend, who seemed to radiate a peace so profound it was almost visible. I mean literally glowing. It's like happiness has decided to use you as its personal billboard. Colleen stood behind her daughter, gently arranging the delicate tiara that Lysander had designed, her hands steady despite the magnitude of emotion she was holding. 23 years ago, she had stood in a similar room, preparing for her own wedding, full of hope and dreams that had been shattered by someone who wasn't ready to understand what love actually required. Today, she watched her daughter prepare to marry a man who had spent 3 years proving daily that he deserved the privilege of loving someone so extraordinary. "Mama," Mooney said softly, meeting her mother's eyes in the mirror. "Thank you for teaching me what love looks like when it's chosen every day instead of just felt when it's convenient." Before Colleen could respond, a gentle knock interrupted the sacred quiet of their preparation. Isabeau opened the door to reveal Celeste Evangeline, elegant in navy silk and pearls, carrying a bouquet that took everyone's breath away. "From Lysander," Celeste said with a smile that held decades of wisdom about love and celebration. "He wanted you to carry something that honored both tradition and the unique beauty of your own story." The bouquet was unlike anything they had ever seen. White roses and gardenias formed the classical foundation, but woven throughout were wildflowers from the meadow where Lysander had first told Mooney he loved her, jasmine from the garden where he had proposed, and tiny sprigs of rosemary and thyme from Seraphim's table, representing remembrance and the flavors that had brought their families together. Wrapped around the stems were ribbons in sage green and ivory, but the most meaningful touch was a small charm made from a piece of the oak tree where Colleen and Gary had first met, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a symbol of how love can grow beautiful things even from broken beginnings. "He wrote something," Celeste added, handing Mooney a small card written in Lysander's careful architect's handwriting. "He said to read it when you were ready to remember why today is just the beginning of your real adventure. My dearest Mooney, in 1 hour you'll walk down that aisle carrying flowers that tell the story of everywhere our love has bloomed. But you'll also be carrying something more precious, the absolute certainty that you are choosing to love someone who will spend every day of his life earning the miracle of being loved by you in return. Today isn't about me winning you. It's about us choosing each other as witnesses to the most beautiful love story ever written." Meanwhile, in the groom's preparation room, Lysander stood before a window overlooking the chapel gardens, adjusting his bow tie with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation rather than nerves. He wore a classic black tuxedo that had been tailored to perfection. But what made him extraordinary wasn't his appearance. It was the way his entire being seemed to vibrate with gratitude for the gift he was about to receive. Aurelius Sterling, serving as his best man, observed his soon-to-be son-in-law with the protective satisfaction of a father who had watched a young man prove himself worthy of loving someone precious. "You ready for this?" he asked, though the question was unnecessary. Lysander had been ready for this moment since the day he met Mooney in that storm-lit library. "I've been ready since I was 12 years old and didn't even know what I was waiting for," Lysander replied, his voice steady with the kind of certainty that only comes from recognizing your destiny when it finally arrives. "I used to design imaginary houses for an imaginary family, and somehow I always included a reading nook by a window where the most beautiful woman in the world would sit and make everything feel like home just by existing." Raphael Montgomery joined them at the window, carrying the rings that would seal promises made not just today, but lived out every day for the past 3 years. "In 40 years of business, I've met a lot of couples," he said with the authority of someone who had learned to recognize authentic love when he saw it. "Most people get married hoping their partner will become someone worthy of lifelong commitment. You two are marrying someone who has already proven they understand what forever means." The chapel was filling with guests who represented every beautiful chapter of Muni and Lysander's love story. Patients from the children's hospital where Muni volunteered sat beside classmates who had been touched by her kindness, while colleagues who respected Lysander's integrity and vision filled the other side. But perhaps most importantly, the front rows were reserved for the chosen family who had helped two souls understand what it meant to love and be loved completely. Pastor Williams took his place at the altar with the reverence of someone who understood he was about to officiate something sacred. In 30 years of performing weddings, he had learned to recognize the difference between ceremonies that celebrated hope and ceremonies that celebrated love that had already been proven. Today felt like the latter, a celebration of what had already been built, rather than what was hoped to be achieved. The string quartet began the processional music, notes floating through the chapel like audible prayers, and one by one the wedding party made their way down the aisle that Caspian had transformed into something that looked like a path through an enchanted garden. Isabeau walked first, her sage-green gown flowing like water, carrying a smaller bouquet that complemented Mooney's, while telling its own story of friendship and loyalty. Behind her came Serafina, radiant with joy for her best friend, followed by little Sophia scattering rose petals with the solemnity of someone who understood she was participating in something magical. Then the music changed, shifting to the melody that Lysander had composed specifically for this moment, and every person in the chapel rose as if drawn by invisible strings, turning to witness what could only be described as grace made visible. Mooney appeared in the doorway on Colleen's arm, and the collective intake of breath from 300 guests created a sound like wind through trees. She moved down the aisle not like someone being given away, but like someone choosing to share her light with the man who had proven he deserved to witness it daily. But perhaps the most extraordinary moment came when Gary Matney, who had somehow gained admission to the ceremony, rose from his seat in the very back row. For one terrible second, it seemed like he might interrupt this sacred procession, might try to claim a role he had never earned. Instead, he simply stood like everyone else, his face a mask of wonder and regret, as he finally understood what he had walked away from 23 years ago. Mooney saw him there, this stranger who shared her DNA but had never shared her life, and for just a moment their eyes met across the chapel, filled with people who had actually loved her. She didn't pause, didn't acknowledge him, didn't let his presence dim her radiance even slightly. Instead, she smiled with the serene confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and with whom, and continued her graceful journey toward the man who had spent 3 years proving he deserved to stand at the end of her aisle. When she reached Lysander, the moment Colleen placed Mooney's hand in his was visible magic. Two souls recognizing each other across lifetimes, choosing each other across all possibilities, promising each other across all the uncertainties that the future might hold. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel that had fallen into reverent silence. We are gathered today not to witness the beginning of love, but to celebrate love that has already proven itself through every season, every challenge, every joy that life has offered these two extraordinary souls. The vows they exchanged were not just words, but poetry written by hearts that understood the sacred nature of the promises being made. Lysander spoke first, his voice steady with the certainty of someone who had found his purpose. Muni, you taught me that love isn't about finding someone who needs you, but about finding someone whose soul speaks the same language as yours. I promise to love you not because I need you to make me whole, but because choosing you makes me the most authentic version of myself. I promise to cherish your dreams as if they were my own, celebrate your victories as if they were mine, and remind you daily that you are not just my greatest love. You are love itself made visible. When Mooni spoke, her words seemed to bless everyone who heard them. Lysander, you taught me that true love doesn't try to complete you, but creates space for you to become everything you're meant to be. I promise to walk beside you as we both become the people we're meant to be together. I promise to choose you every morning with the same wonder as this moment, to love you every evening with the same gratitude as this breath, and to build with you a love so extraordinary that it lights the way for others still searching for home. The moment they were pronounced husband and wife and shared their first kiss as a married couple, something shifted in the very air of the chapel. It was as if love itself had been given form and witnesses, and everyone present understood they had been granted the privilege of seeing what devotion looked like when it was built on the foundation of two people who understood their own worth completely. As the newly married couple made their way back down the aisle, radiant with joy that seemed to bless everyone they passed, Gary remained standing in his back row seat, finally understanding that he wasn't witnessing what he had lost, but what he had never been worthy of having in the first place. The recessional music swelled as Mooni and Lysander paused at the chapel doors, turning back for one last look at the sacred space where they had just promised their hearts to each other. In that moment, with afternoon sunlight streaming through ancient windows and the faces of everyone they loved glowing with happiness, they understood that this wasn't an ending but a beginning, the first day of a love story that would be written in daily choices, small kindnesses, and the unwavering commitment to see the best in each other, even when the world tried to convince them to settle for less. Chapter 9. The Queen's Justice. When Grace Becomes Judgment. There are moments when the universe orchestrates perfect justice, not through courtrooms or conflict, but through the simple revelation of truth spoken by someone who has learned to wield grace like the most elegant weapon. And as the golden hour painted the garden reception in shades of amber and rose, destiny prepared to demonstrate what happens when earned love faces the hollow echo of abandoned responsibility. The gardens of the Rosewood estate had been transformed into something that belonged in fairy tales, where every bloom seemed to dance in celebration, and every breeze carried the scent of jasmine and the promise of forever. Tables draped in ivory silk and adorned with arrangements that looked like they had been gathered by woodland fairies dotted the landscape, while strings of lights created constellations above the heads of guests who moved through this magical space with the reverent joy of people who understood they were witnessing something sacred. Mooni and Lysander sat at the head table like the royalty they had become through their choice to love authentically, surrounded by the constellation of chosen family who had helped them understand what commitment looked like when it was built on foundation of mutual respect and genuine devotion. The emerald on Mooni's finger caught the golden light as she laughed at something Serafina whispered in her ear, while Lysander's eyes never strayed far from his bride's face, as if he were still trying to absorb the miracle of being loved by someone so extraordinary. The reception had unfolded like a love letter written by the universe itself, Aurelius Sterling's toast that made hardened businessmen weep. Isabeau Valentina's speech about friendship that transcends circumstance, and Celeste Evangeline's blessing that seemed to settle over the gathering like starlight made audible. Children ran through the gardens with flower crowns askew and laughter that sounded like wind chimes, while their parents swayed to music that seemed to emanate from the very air. It was during the traditional father-daughter dance, which Colleen and Mooney shared to a melody that Lysander had composed specifically for this moment, that Gary made his move. The music, a haunting piece about mothers and daughters and love that endures through every season, filled the space as the two women who had survived and thrived together moved in perfect harmony, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a love story that had been written by choice rather than chance. The song was reaching its crescendo when Gary emerged from the shadows at the edge of the garden, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair making him look like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong stage. He approached the dance floor with the entitled confidence of someone who had convinced himself that DNA granted automatic access to moments that had been earned through presence and devotion. The music stopped. Not gradually, not naturally, but with the sudden silence that accompanies the presence of something that doesn't belong. The string quartet, sensing the shift in energy, lowered their instruments as if they understood that this interruption required a different kind of symphony altogether. Every guest turned to witness this unfolding drama, but their attention wasn't focused on Gary. It was drawn like magnets to Muni, who stood in the center of the dance floor in her goddess gown, still in her husband's protective embrace, radiating the kind of serene authority that makes kings remember their manners and cowards recognize their limitations. "Muni," Gary said, his voice carrying across the silent garden with the desperation of someone who had finally run out of chances and money to buy his way into hearts that had learned to protect themselves. "I know I don't deserve to be here, but I couldn't let this day pass without telling you that you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love you the way you deserved." The silence that followed was pregnant with 23 years of consequences, 2 decades of choices made and unmade, and the weight of words that should have been spoken before they required an audience to witness their inadequacy. But if Gary expected tears or reconciliation or the kind of dramatic forgiveness that happens in movies where absent fathers return to claim their rightful place, he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman his daughter had become. Muni stepped forward with movements that seemed choreographed by grace itself, leaving Lysander's protective embrace not because she needed to face Gary alone, but because she wanted everyone present to witness what dignity looked like when it was wielded by someone who had never doubted her own worth. The tiara in her dark hair caught the fading sunlight, making her look like a queen preparing to deliver judgment with the authority of someone who had earned her crown through character rather than inheritance. "You want to know what beauty looks like?" she asked, her voice carrying like honey over steel. "Beauty is a mother who turned abandonment into abundance, betrayal into blessing, and ending into beginning. Beauty is friends who chose love over convenience, mentors who became family by heart, not blood." She gestured to the garden alive with celebration. "Beauty is a husband who spent 3 years proving that love is a verb, not a noun. This celebration, this joy radiating from every corner, this is what you traded for gold that can't buy happiness, success that can't purchase souls, wealth that can't create connection." Gary opened his mouth to speak, but Muni continued with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful words are those spoken from certainty rather than desperation. "You stand before 3 generations of women who learned to love without you, dream without you, and thrive without you. You see this celebration, this joy, this love that fills every corner of this sacred space. This is what you traded for money that can't buy happiness, success that can't purchase meaning, achievements that can't create connection." The garden had become a cathedral, every guest a witness to justice being delivered not through anger or bitterness, but through the simple revelation of truth, spoken by someone who had transformed abandonment into strength. Colleen stood beside her daughter, the sapphire ring on her finger catching light like captured starfire, while Lysander remained close enough to offer support, but far enough away to let Mooney's words carry their full weight. "I forgive you," Mooney said, and the words seemed to bless the very air around them. "Not for your sake, but for mine, because I refuse to carry your choices as my burden. But forgiveness is not reconciliation, understanding is not invitation, and DNA is not destiny." She turned slightly, including in her gaze the chosen family who had surrounded her with love that had been earned through presence. "You had 23 years to earn the right to stand here, 23 years to choose love over fear, responsibility over comfort, growth over stagnation. Instead, you chose gold over love, pride over family, wealth over worth. That was your choice, and choices have consequences that cannot be purchased away." The tears streaming down the faces of guests were not for Gary's pain, but for the magnificence of witnessing grace in action, justice delivered through truth rather than vengeance, and strength displayed through peace rather than conflict. Even the children who had been playing in the gardens had grown still, sensing that something important was happening in the space between heartbreak and healing. "This," Mooney continued, gesturing to encompass the wedding reception that had become something far more significant. "This is what love looks like when it's built by people who understand that every day is a choice to show up or step away, to invest or withdraw, to nurture or neglect. You see the man standing beside me? He has loved me through ordinary Tuesdays and difficult conversations, through dreams achieved and obstacles overcome. He has earned his place here through 1,000 small choices to prioritize our love above his own comfort." Lysander's love for his wife was written so clearly across his features that even strangers could read it. But more than that, his respect for her strength was evident in the way he stood, close enough to catch her if she fell, but understanding that she was far too powerful to need catching. "You see my mother?" Muni asked, and Colleen stepped forward to stand beside her daughter with the regal bearing of someone who had transformed survival into triumph. She chose to see abandonment as freedom, betrayal as opportunity, and endings as beginnings. She taught me that queens are not born, but created through the daily choice to love fiercely and build beautifully even when the world tries to convince you to settle for less. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades that seemed too beautiful to be real, as if creation itself wanted to provide the perfect backdrop for words that would be remembered long after the last guest had gone home. "You want to make this right?" Muni asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Then understand that right cannot be retroactively achieved through apology or purchased through expensive gestures. Right is built through presence, patience, and the humility to understand that some invitations cannot be extended because they were never yours to receive." She paused, letting the weight of truth settle over the garden like dew on roses, before delivering her final words with the authority of someone who had learned to protect her peace at all costs. "I wish you healing. I wish you growth. And I wish you the wisdom to understand that the greatest gift you can give the daughter you never knew is the space to continue becoming herself without the burden of your regret." Gary stood there in the golden light of a reception he had never been invited to, finally understanding that he wasn't witnessing what he had lost. He was witnessing what he had never been worthy of having. The family he had imagined waiting for his return had instead flourished in his absence, becoming something more magnificent than his limited imagination could have ever encompassed. "Now," Mooney said, turning back toward Lysander with a smile that could have powered entire cities, I believe my husband and I have some dancing to do. We have a lifetime of celebrations ahead of us, and this is just the beautiful beginning. The music resumed, not the haunting melody of mothers and daughters, but the joyful symphony of new beginnings, and as the newly married couple took their place on the dance floor, surrounded by everyone who had earned the right to witness their love, Gary walked away into the gathering darkness, carrying with him the understanding that some stories end not with redemption, but with the recognition that redemption must be earned rather than claimed. In the warm glow of the reception that continued long into the night, surrounded by love that had been built rather than bought, Mounier danced with her husband while her mother smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who had succeeded in raising a daughter who knew her worth so completely that she would never settle for anything less than extraordinary love. Chapter 10. When Phoenix Souls Teach Eagles to Fly. Redemption Through Silent Service. 5 years can teach even the most stubborn hearts what love actually looks like when it's lived rather than declared. And in the golden afternoon light of Willowbrook Park, where children's laughter mingles with the whisper of ancient oak trees, the universe prepared to demonstrate that redemption is not a destination to be reached, but a path to be walked daily, with humility as the only acceptable compass. The laughter of twin 4-year-old girls carried across the park like wind chimes made of pure joy, their matching sundresses the color of summer skies, dancing as they chased butterflies through meadows that seemed to bloom more vibrantly whenever they were near. Celeste Rose and Evangeline Hope Beaumont possessed their mother's luminous spirit and their father's gentle wisdom. But more than that, they carried themselves with the confident grace of children who had never doubted they were treasured simply for existing. It was the spring of 2013, and Mouni sat on a blanket beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree, watching her daughters with eyes that held the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered that happiness multiplied when it was shared with souls who understood its value. At 27, motherhood had added new dimensions to her beauty, the serene confidence of someone who knew she was exactly where she belonged. Lysander emerged from the small playground structure he had been examining, his architect's mind automatically cataloging improvements that could make the space more magical for children who deserved beauty in every corner of their lives. The climbing structure needs repair, he said, settling beside his wife with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had spent 5 years proving that true love grows stronger with each passing season. I'm thinking of proposing a complete redesign to the city council. You want to redesign every playground in the city? Mooney laughed, leaning into his embrace. Last week it was the library's children's section, and before that, you were sketching improvements for the hospital's family rooms. Can you blame me? Lysander asked, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. I want every child to grow up in spaces as beautiful as the ones our daughters will inherit. Their life together had unfolded like the most beautiful symphony. They lived in a house that Lysander had designed specifically for their growing family, not a mansion that announced wealth, but a home that whispered welcome from every corner. Colleen lived in the converted carriage house on their property, close enough to be daily involved in her granddaughters' lives, but independent enough to continue building her own empire of healing spaces. Seraphim's table had grown into 5 locations, each one a sanctuary where broken hearts found healing and lonely souls discovered family. Colleen's partnership with Aurelia Sterling had evolved into something that was changing their entire city. Restaurants that employed single mothers, community gardens that brought neighbors together, and scholarship programs that helped children understand that their worth was never negotiable. Mama Colleen is teaching the girls how to braid flower crowns, Celeste Rose announced, running toward her parents with a creation that looked like it had been woven by fairy godmothers. Her dark hair flew behind her like silk ribbons as she moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had been raised on pure love. And we learned about the brave queens, added Evangeline Hope, whose eyes held the same ancient wisdom that had marked her mother as extraordinary from birth. Mama Colleen told us about Cleopatra, who spoke 9 languages, and Joan of Arc, who heard angels. And she said we come from a long line of women who know how to love the world back to life. Mooney's heart swelled as she watched her daughters absorb the same lessons that had shaped her into the woman she had become. They were growing up understanding that strength came not from having power over others, but from knowing their own worth so completely that they could never be diminished by anyone else's insecurity or absence. It was in this moment of perfect contentment that Gary Matney appeared at the edge of the park, but not as the entitled stranger who had disrupted their wedding 5 years earlier. This Gary moved with the careful humility of someone who had spent years learning what service looked like when it was offered without expectation of recognition or reward. He carried a simple toolbox and wore clothes that spoke of honest work rather than expensive tailoring, his hands bearing the calluses of someone who had learned to build rather than simply buy. For 5 years he had walked a path of silent redemption, liquidating his holdings to fund scholarships for children of single mothers, building homes for families like the one he had abandoned, working with therapists to understand the emptiness he had tried to fill with gold. His weekly visits to this park had become a ritual of penance and service. He would arrive early in the morning to repair playground equipment, plant flowers, clean graffiti, and ensure that children had safe, beautiful spaces to dream and play. He never approached families, never announced his presence, never sought recognition for the improvements that mysteriously appeared like gifts from benevolent spirits. Today, he worked on the climbing structure that Lysander had noticed needed attention, his movements careful and purposeful as he reinforced joints and sanded rough edges. He had learned carpentry and landscaping not as hobbies, but as forms of prayer, ways to contribute beauty to a world where his daughters were growing up, even if he would never be part of their daily story. Colleen emerged from the children's garden where she had been teaching her granddaughters the ancient art of coaxing beauty from earth and seed, her silver hair catching the afternoon light like a crown earned through grace rather than birth. At 47, she moved with the serene confidence of someone who had transformed every challenge into wisdom. She noticed Gary immediately, not because she had been looking for him, but because mothers develop an instinct for recognizing when the universe is preparing to teach another lesson about the difference between claiming love and earning it. She watched him work with the focused intensity of someone who had learned that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice to contribute rather than consume. "Girls," she said to her granddaughters, "would you like to help me check on the rose garden? I think some of the new blooms need our approval." As they walked toward the garden, little Celeste's flower crown began to fall apart, the delicate stems too short to hold the elaborate design she had envisioned. Her disappointment was immediate and complete, the kind of pure emotion that children feel before they learn to hide their hearts behind politeness. Gary noticed the small tragedy unfolding and made a decision that surprised even him. Without approaching the family directly, he quietly left a perfectly braided flower crown on the bench where they had been sitting, not an intrusion into their space, but a gift offered to the universe with the hope that it might ease a child's disappointment. When they returned from the garden, Celeste discovered the crown with the wonder that only children can feel when magic appears unexpectedly. "Look, Mama, someone left me a present." She placed the crown on her head with the solemnity of a princess accepting her rightful tiara, and the sight of her joy was enough to make the angels themselves weep with happiness. Mooney looked at the crown with the discerning eye of someone who had been raised to recognize craftsmanship, and something about the intricate braiding pattern seemed familiar. She glanced across the park to where a solitary figure was quietly packing tools into a worn canvas bag, his head down, his movements careful not to draw attention to himself. For the first time in 5 years, their eyes met across the distance that separated who he was from who he had chosen to become. It lasted only a heartbeat, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something more profound. Recognition that even the most broken souls can learn to love properly when they stop demanding and start serving. In that single glance, Muni saw not the stranger who had abandoned her, but a man who had spent 5 years learning what fatherhood actually meant, not through blood or presence, but through silent sacrifice. And Gary saw not the child he had lost, but the woman he had never deserved to know, raised by love so pure it had taught her to recognize authentic redemption when it finally arrived. Evangeline Hope tugged on her mother's dress, drawing her attention back to what mattered. "Mama, can we go feed the ducks?" "Mama Colleen said they liked the special bread we brought, and I want to show them my flower crown." "Of course, sweetheart," Muni said, lifting her daughter with the ease of someone who had learned that the most precious things in life were not heavy burdens, but gifts so light they made you feel capable of flying. "Let's go show the ducks how beautiful you are." As the family walked toward the pond, Gary finished his work in silence. He would return next week, and the week after, and every week for as long as he drew breath. Not because he expected redemption, but because he had finally learned what love looked like when it was offered without condition or expectation. Gary stood there in the golden light of a reception he had never been invited to, finally understanding that he wasn't witnessing what he had lost. He was witnessing what he had never been worthy of having. The family he had imagined waiting for his return had instead flourished in his absence, becoming something more magnificent than his limited imagination could have ever encompassed. As the sun began to set over Willowbrook Park, painting the sky in shades that seemed too beautiful to be real, a family walked hand in hand toward their home, where love lived in every room and gratitude blessed every meal. Behind them, a man worked alone to make the world more beautiful for children who would never know his name, finally understanding that some forms of love are best expressed through silent service rather than spoken claims. The Phoenix souls had taught the eagle to fly not through forgiveness or reconciliation, but through the simple demonstration that true love is not something you receive, but something you become. And that becoming is a choice made new each morning, measured not in what you claim, but in what you contribute to the beauty and healing of a world that needs more hearts willing to serve rather than take.